The last man to die did so at 10:59 a.m. I didn't see it happen, but I heard about it later. Some poor bastard from the 89th Division shot by a German sniper 1 minute before the war ended. 1 minute, 60 seconds between him and going home. I think about him sometimes. Wonder if he knew. Wonder if he heard the rumors that morning, the whispers running up and down the line that it was almost over. Wonder if he thought he'd made it. We all knew something was coming. You could feel it in the air that morning, November 11th, 1918. The shelling had been lighter for days. The attacks had slowed. Even the snipers seemed half-hearted, like nobody wanted to be the last man to kill or the last man to die. I'm Sergeant William Marsh, 28th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the big red one. I'd been in France since June of 1917, fought at Cantigny, Soissons, Saint-Mihiel, the Meuse-Argonne. 18 months of mud and blood and watching boys younger than my kid brother get torn apart by machine gun fire. That morning, we were in a village called Sedan, or what was left of it. The Germans had pulled back during the night. We'd moved in at dawn, cautious, expecting resistance. Found nothing but empty trenches and abandoned equipment. A few dead horses. Some gear they couldn't carry. The silence was wrong. After months of constant artillery, the quiet felt like pressure in your skull. Like the air before a thunderstorm. Waiting for something to break. Our captain called us together around 10:30. He had a piece of paper in his hand, and his face looked strange. Not happy, not sad, just strange. "Boys," he said. His voice was rough. "At 1100 hours, the fighting stops. Armistice, the war is over." Nobody cheered. Nobody said anything. We just stood there in the ruins of that French village, covered in mud, stinking of cordite and sweat and death, trying to understand what those words meant. The war is over. I'd been trying to survive for so long, I'd forgotten there could be an after. Forgotten there was anything beyond the next attack, the next barrage, the next night in a frozen trench, listening to rats eat the corpses in no man's land. We had 30 minutes left. 30 minutes until 11 o'clock. 30 minutes until peace. We waited. Some of the boys sat down right there in the street, just dropped to the ground like their legs had given out. Miller was crying, quiet tears running down his dirty face. Jackson lit a cigarette with shaking hands, took one drag, then threw it away like it tasted wrong. Young Patterson just stared at nothing, his eyes empty. We were in a church square. The building had taken a shell at some point. The roof was gone, one wall collapsed, but the bell tower still stood. The bell was still up there, hanging silent. It had been silent for years, I figured. Nobody rings church bells during an artillery barrage. The minutes crawled by. 10:35, 10:40, 10:45. I kept waiting for something to happen, for the Germans to launch one final attack, for our artillery to open up one last time, for something to go wrong, because in 18 months, everything had always gone wrong. But nothing happened. The silence held. At 10:50, we started hearing it. Distant at first, then growing. Gunfire, artillery, not directed at us, somewhere to the south, maybe 5 miles away. Someone was still fighting. Someone hadn't gotten the word, or didn't care, or wanted to fire that one last shot. The sound made my teeth ache, made me want to find a hole and crawl into it. That's what 18 months does to you. You hear guns and your body reacts before your brain can catch up. Muscles tense, breathing goes shallow. Hands reach for a rifle. Even knowing the war was ending, the sound of those guns made me afraid. 10:55. The firing to the south intensified. A real battle sounds like. Machine guns rattling, the crump of mortars. Men were dying down there, dying with 5 minutes left. 4 minutes, 3. Jesus Christ, someone whispered. Just stop. Just fucking stop. But they didn't stop. They kept firing, kept killing. right up until the end. Our captain was checking his watch every few seconds. His hand was shaking. He'd been with us since Cantigny, survived everything, and now he was shaking because peace was coming, and somehow that was harder than war. 10:58. The gunfire to the south reached a crescendo, like they were trying to pack every last bit of killing into the time they had left, like they were racing the clock. 10:59. I looked at the bell tower, at that silent bell. Wondered if it still worked. Wondered if anyone would ring it. The gunfire cut off, not gradually, just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. 1 second there was the sound of war, and the next there was nothing. Nothing at all. My watch said 11 o'clock. The war was over. For maybe 10 seconds, there was absolute silence. No guns, no voices, no movement, just silence so complete it felt solid, felt like you could touch it. Then the bell rang. I don't know who rang it. Some French civilian who'd been hiding in the ruins, maybe. Or one of our boys who'd climbed up there. Or maybe it rang itself, I don't know. But it rang. One clear note that cut through the silence like a knife, then another. And another. And then every bell in every village for miles around started ringing. Church bells, chapel bells, bells that hadn't rung in 4 years suddenly singing out all at once. The sound rolled across the countryside like a wave, like the earth itself was celebrating. I dropped to my knees. I don't know why. My legs just gave out. I knelt there in the mud of that church square with my hands over my face, and I couldn't tell if I was laughing or crying or both. The bells kept ringing, 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 and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but kneel there and shake. Around me, the other boys were breaking down too. Miller was sobbing openly now. Jackson had his arms around Patterson, both of them holding each other up. Our captain just stood there with tears running down his face, not even trying to hide them. The bells rang and rang and rang. They should have been beautiful. They should have been the most beautiful sound in the world. But all I could hear was the silence underneath them. The silence of all the voices that would never hear these bells. All the boys who died waiting for this moment. Tommy Chen, blown apart by a shell at Soissons. He'd never hear the bells. Robert Hayes, gassed at Saint-Michel, dead in a field hospital, drowning in his own lungs. He'd never hear the bells. Little Eddie Morrison, just 17, lied about his age to enlist. Took a machine gun burst across the chest in the Argonne. Died calling for his mother. He'd never hear the bells. The list went on and on, names and faces. Boys I'd trained with, fought with, buried with my own hands in muddy graves that would probably never be found. They'd never hear these bells. And I was alive. I was kneeling in a French village listening to bells ring for peace. And I was alive and they weren't. Why? Why me and not them? What had I done to deserve survival? What made my life worth more than Tommy's or Robert's or Eddie's? Nothing. Nothing at all. It was just chance. Random, meaningless chance. A shell lands 3 feet to the left instead of the right. A sniper's bullet misses by an inch. You zig when you should have zagged. That's all that separated the living from the dead. Luck. Goddamn luck. The bells kept ringing, joyful, triumphant, celebrating the end of the war to end all wars. Celebrating peace, celebrating victory. But all I could feel was the weight of all those names, all those faces, all those ghosts that would follow me for the rest of my life. The weight of surviving when better men than me had died. The bells rang for maybe 20 minutes. When they finally stopped, the silence that followed felt even heavier than before. Someone said, "We made it." But had we? Had we really? The French civilians started emerging from the ruins. Old men, women, children. They'd been hiding in cellars and basements, waiting out the war in the dark. Now they came out blinking into the daylight, hardly believing it was over. They were crying and laughing and hugging each other, hugging us, too. An old woman grabbed my face and kissed both my cheeks, saying something in French I couldn't understand, probably thanking me, probably calling me a hero. I wasn't a hero. I was just someone who hadn't died yet. Someone broke out wine from somewhere. Bottles appeared, passing from hand to hand. The French were singing, La Marseillaise probably, though I didn't know the words. Some of our boys started singing too. Over there. It's a long way to Tipperary. Songs we'd sung in training, back when we thought war was an adventure. I took a drink when the bottle came to me. The wine was sour, probably had been hidden in some cellar since 1914. It burned going down. I took another drink anyway, and another. Maybe if I drank enough, I wouldn't feel this anymore. This emptiness, this weight. The party grew. More soldiers appeared from nearby units. British boys who'd been fighting since 1914. French troops with dead eyes and hollow faces. Everyone drinking, singing, celebrating. The war was over. We'd won. But I looked at those French soldiers, saw how they moved, saw how they flinched at loud noises, saw how they didn't quite smile even when they were laughing. 4 years they'd been at this. 4 years of watching their country get torn apart, their friends die, their world burn. They'd won, but what had they won? Their villages were rubble, their fields were graveyards, their generation was dead or broken. Victory didn't bring any of that back. I got drunk that day, really drunk. First time in 18 months I'd let myself lose control. Miller and I sat in the ruins of that church, passing a bottle back and forth, not talking, just drinking. "We made it, Billy," he said finally. His voice was slurred. "We actually fucking made it." "Yeah," I said, "we made it." But I was thinking about Eddie Morrison, about how he'd shown me pictures of his girl back home, about how he'd talked about marrying her, buying a little house, having kids, about how he'd had plans, dreams, a whole life ahead of him. And now he was dead in a muddy hole in the Argonne, and I was alive getting drunk in a French village, and none of it made any sense. The celebration went on around us, people dancing in the ruins, singing in the rubble, making joy out of devastation. I couldn't feel it, couldn't feel anything but tired, so tired. The party lasted all night. At some point, I passed out, woke up the next morning with the worst hangover of my life, lying in the street with my head pounding and my mouth tasting like death. The village was quiet again. The French civilians were starting to pick through the ruins, salvaging what they could. The soldiers were mostly sleeping it off like me, scattered around like corpses, which was funny in a way that wasn't funny at all. I sat up slowly. Everything hurt. My head, my body, my soul. The church bell was still there, hanging in its broken tower. Silent now. Just a bell again. But I could still hear it ringing in my head. Would probably hear it for the rest of my life. Miller was sitting nearby, his back against a wall, smoking. He saw me wake up and nodded. Didn't say anything. What was there to say? We'd survived. That was supposed to be enough. That was supposed to be everything. So why did it feel like nothing? Our captain gathered us up around noon. Said we'd be moving out soon, heading back to a rear area. Eventually we'd ship home. Back to America. Back to our lives. Our lives. I'd forgotten I had one of those. I tried to remember what I used to care about. Before the war. Before France. Before all of this. There was a girl, I think. Mary, Martha. I couldn't picture her face anymore. There was a job at my uncle's store. There was a little apartment I'd been saving up for. It all seemed like it had happened to someone else. Some other William Marsh who'd existed before Cantigny and Soissons and the Argonne. That boy was gone. Whoever I was now, I wasn't him. "You okay, Sarge?" Patterson asked. The kid looked young, too young. How old was he? 19? 20? Younger than Eddie had been. "Yeah," I lied. "I'm fine." I wasn't fine. None of us were fine. We were broken pieces pretending to be whole men. But what else could you say? That night, I dreamed about the bells. In my dream, they were ringing and ringing and ringing, but instead of joy, the sound was screaming. The bells were screaming with the voices of all the dead boys, and I was standing in no man's land trying to make them stop, but they wouldn't stop. They just kept screaming and screaming and screaming. I woke up gasping. It was still dark. Miller was awake too, staring at nothing. "Heard the bells," he said quietly. "In my sleep." "Me too," I said. We sat there in the dark, two broken soldiers listening to the silence where the guns used to be. The war was over, but it would never be over, not for us. They're interviewing me now in 1960, asking me to talk about the war, about the Armistice, about the bells. They want to record it for history, they say, so people remember. I'm 64 years old. My hair is white. My hands shake. I've got grandkids who've never known war, who think of 1918 as ancient history. To them, it might as well be the Civil War or the Revolution, just something in a textbook. But I remember. God help me, I remember everything. I came home in March of 1919. There were parades, people cheering, pretty girls throwing flowers. Everyone wanted to hear about the war, wanted me to tell them stories about courage and glory and heroism. I smiled and told them what they wanted to hear. Didn't tell them about the mud or the rats or the smell of gangrene. Didn't tell them about Eddie dying in my arms, or about the French village where I got drunk while sitting on rubble that used to be someone's home. Didn't tell them that I heard those bells in my nightmares. Still do. I married Mary. Yes, it was Mary, I remembered eventually, and we had 3 kids. I worked at the store, then opened my own. Did pretty well for myself. On paper, I had a good life, an American life, the life Eddie never got to have. But I've been carrying them with me all these years, all those dead boys. They never got old. They're still 19, still 20, still frozen in 1918 while the rest of us kept aging. Sometimes I look in the mirror and I don't recognize the old man staring back. Because in my head I'm still 22, still covered in mud, still kneeling in that French village listening to bells ring. The thing about surviving is that it never stops. You don't survive once and then move on. You survive every day, over and over, forever. You survive breakfast and work and dinner and putting your kids to bed. You survive holidays and anniversaries and grandkids' birthdays. You survive and survive and survive, and every moment of that survival is built on the bodies of boys who didn't. I hear church bells sometimes here in America. Sunday mornings, weddings, funerals. Every time I'm back there, back in that square in Sedan, back in the mud and the ruins and the weight of it all. The interviewer asks me what the Armistice meant to me, what I felt when I heard those bells. I don't know how to answer. How do you explain that the happiest moment of your life was also the moment you realized you'd carry death with you forever? How do you explain that peace felt like a betrayal because all your friends were dead? How do you explain survivor's guilt to someone who's never had to survive anything? I tell him the bells were beautiful. I tell him we celebrated. I tell him the war was over and we were grateful. I don't tell him the truth, that the bells have been ringing in my head for 42 years, that I still hear them every night before I fall asleep, that they don't sound like celebration anymore, if they ever did. They sound like mourning. The war ended November 11th, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning. But I'm still there. still kneeling in that mud, still listening to those bells ring for boys who died before they heard them, still wondering why I survived when better men didn't. The interviewer thanks me for my service, calls me a hero, says my generation saved the world. I nod and smile and shake his hand. But I know the truth. I know what we paid. I know what I lost in those French fields, and it wasn't something I could ever get back. The bells rang on November 11th, 1918. They rang for peace. They rang for victory. They rang for the end of the war, to end all wars. But in my head, they're ringing for the dead, for all the boys who never came home, for all the voices that went silent before they ever heard those bells. And they'll keep ringing until the day I die, maybe even after that. We never came home. Not really. Part of me is still in France, still in that church square, still 22 years old and covered in mud and wondering why I'm alive and they're not. The bells ring forever, and I'll never stop hearing them.